Hello and welcome to the Intentional Brief, your weekly video update on the one big thing in cybersecurity news for growth stage companies, investors, and their management teams. I'm your host, Shay Colson, managing partner at Intentional Cybersecurity, and you can find us online at intentionalcyber.com. Today is Monday, July 22nd, 2024, and here's hoping that if you're a CrowdStrike customer and a Windows user, you have survived the response process and most of your computers are back to normal operation. Instead of focusing on the technical details around the event itself, I think this week we would better spend our time looking at some lessons learned from events like this and see how we can get better, whether we were impacted by this or not. So just by way of brief background, endpoint detection and response vendor CrowdStrike pushed an update on Friday morning that caused computers running Microsoft Windows to crash and be unable to boot back without manual intervention. This caused what is being called by some as the largest IT outage in history, and maybe rightly so. I think due to the nature of this update, it only impacted Windows machines, so while Linux and Mac users were spared, as were non-CrowdStrike customers, it still hit about 8.5 million computers all at once, all across the world. Microsoft, for their part, has tried to distance themselves from this event despite the fact that it resulted in the ominous traditional blue screen of death, and noted that this was, quote, not a Microsoft incident, unquote, and that the incident impacted, quote, less than 1% of all Windows machines worldwide. I think it's also worth noting that CrowdStrike themselves had suffered another incident recently where a software update caused computers to max out their processors, but that was relatively quickly identified and remediated, but does, I think, raise some questions about their quality assurance processes. Senators on the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation have already called for an explanation from both CrowdStrike and Microsoft, and I'm sure we'll get drips and drabs of news around these events in the coming weeks. But given all of this, what lessons should we take away from this event? I think, first of all, it's worth acknowledging that this was, in fact, an incident, and that many organizations had to invoke their incident response, disaster recovery, business continuity plans. Microsoft used the word incident in their own press release, and even though the CrowdStrike CEO was quick to emphasize on social media that this was not a security incident, I would disagree. Traditional security theory offers what's known as the CIA triad, that deals with confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and the relationship between those three things. And this incident struck at the core of the availability pillar and put many companies in a difficult position. So while this wasn't a ransomware attack or it didn't involve data loss, it absolutely had an impact on businesses and should be treated as such. Actually, I would encourage any business who had to invoke their contingency plans to perform a full after-action review to try and capture lessons learned for future events. These future events could be something like this, again, a software update, some sort of an error, or it could be something simple like a storm or a construction crew knocks out internet connections for an office, or Microsoft or Google suffers an outage impacting email or documents, or both. I think understanding how your business can continue to operate in a contingency mode is a critical thing at this stage. Speaking of future events, I know there are lots of companies who are either second-guessing their own choice to buy CrowdStrike as an EDR solution or other EDR companies looking to come in and gain market share. I won't make prognostications either way about should you, shouldn't you, but I will say that I have to imagine CrowdStrike is going to have by far the most effort, energy, and attention paid to their product deployments for the foreseeable future as they try and avoid another incident like this. It's not to say that it can't happen, but I suspect they'll do everything in their power to prevent it. Finally, I think this is a good reminder of a couple of things that are happening in the market writ large, even though they're happening very subtly in this space. The first is a move towards consolidation. I think the technology sector is going to force us to have fewer and fewer choices, which has the potential to exacerbate issues like this. Secondly, the complexity and interoperability of these systems is difficult to understand and manage for individuals and even teams. There was a great piece in The Atlantic, which I've linked to below, that highlights this issue and I think is very much worth reading as we manage these complex equations. And then finally, I think it's worth remembering that everything in security is a trade-off. And so while we do find ourselves in this uncomfortable position of having an enterprise security tool cause a global security incident, we need to balance that risk with a similar risk in running any other endpoint tool, as well as the risk that we would encounter if we ran without these tools in place to defend against the modern myriad of threats. So no easy decisions, no easy discussions here, but a lot of opportunity to learn lessons, get better, and make more risk-informed choices to help manage our businesses moving forward. From a fundraising perspective, a very light week with only $4.1 billion in newly committed capital. And we'll have to see how the rumored Wiz acquisition is potentially impacted by this CrowdStrike incident from an antitrust perspective. I can see some skittishness. I can see the deal having a different feel in a post-CrowdStrike world. But we'll have to wait and see. Meanwhile, I see news that another big tech firm, Smartsheet, is reportedly considering a buyout option as they look to go private and wrestle with a continued run of losses from a cash flow perspective. So we will see how the market looks at that in the weeks ahead. You can find links to all the articles we covered in the comment section below. You can find back issues of these videos and written transcripts at intentionalcyber.com. And we will see you next week for another edition of the Intentional Brief.